There are records that do not begin with a scream, nor with an exact date, but with an absence too long to be ignored. In the archives of Harlan Ridge County, a mountainous region located between the interior of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, there is a simple note written in pencil in a 1907 incident book. It does not describe a crime. It does not report a body. It simply states that spring, 6 people entered the back trails of the mountains, and none returned the same way. At first glance, it seems like just another case of people getting lost in an era of poor roads and limited communication. But what makes this case unique is the insistence with which it reappears in different documents over the course of almost 20 years. Always incomplete, always interrupted, as if someone had closed the file before the story was finished. The central protagonist of these records is Elias Harper, a 38-year-old farmer known in the Pine Hollow community for his methodical temperament and for never leaving home without warning. Married, father of 2 young children, Elias had grown up in that region and knew the mountains like few others. His name appears in the documents not as an adventurer or outsider, but as someone who would never have gotten lost through recklessness. At the time, the community of Pine Hollow consisted of just over 40 families scattered throughout the valley. Dark wooden houses, built near waterways, surrounded by irregular fields and the constant presence of the mountain in the background, a silent wall that delimited the known world. The mountains were not seen as a threat, but as a respected obstacle. No one crossed its shortcuts without real need. The weather in the spring of 1907 was described as unstable. Agricultural reports mention persistent fog in the early morning hours and quick showers in the late afternoon. The elders of the region used to say that this was the kind of weather that confuses trails, erasing old marks and creating detours where there had once been a firm path. The Harper family lived a simple life. Elias grew corn and raised a few head of cattle. His wife, Margaret, was responsible for the home and the children's early education. Nothing in the subsequent testimonies suggests family conflicts, significant debts, or any intention to flee. On the contrary, the reports describe a predictable, almost rigid routine, sustained by fixed schedules and familiar routes. What is known for certain is that, in early May, Elias agreed to accompany 5 other residents of the region to the village of Red Creek, on the other side of the mountain range. The trip, via the main road, would take almost 2 days. The shortcut through the mountains promised to cut the journey in half, something that had been attempted before, but rarely. In the official records, this detail appears only as a side note, written with less care than the rest of the text. There is no description of the exact reason for the trip, only a note that the group intended to return before the following nightfall. What catches the attention of researchers is not only the collective disappearance, but the way the documents contradict each other in the following days. Some reports mention 5 people, others mention 6. One name appears crossed out, another appears written with a different spelling. It is as if, from the outset, not even the exact number of those who left was fully fixed in the official memory. And there is one final detail, almost always overlooked on first reading. In the local church book, where prolonged absences were recorded for collective prayer purposes, someone wrote a short sentence next to the names weeks after the event. They took the short way. No explanation accompanies this note, no subsequent correction. Just these 4 words, repeated in more than one record, as if they were enough to explain everything. It is from this documentary silence, and from what was never officially recorded, that this case really begins. Before the disappearance, life in Pine Hollow followed a predictable, almost unchanging rhythm. The days were marked by natural light, the distant sound of streams, and the repetitive work that kept the community cohesive. Nothing there happened quickly. Changes were slow, gradual, almost imperceptible, which would make what happened even more disturbing for those who remained. Elias Harper was seen as a reliable man. He was not outgoing, but he was present. He attended church meetings, helped neighbors during harvest time, and rarely was absent for more than a day. Testimonies gathered years later describe someone who weighed every decision, someone who did not take easy shortcuts. Ironically, the word that would later define the group's fate. The other men who would accompany him on that trip were also well known in the region. Thomas Reed, a locksmith, had been a widower for 3 years. Caleb Monroe, a young newlywed man, was looking to trade tools in Red Creek. Jonah Whitfield, an older farmer, was considered experienced on the mountain trails, and 2 brothers, Samuel and Robert Knox, were responsible for transporting goods between smaller villages. None of them were outsiders. None were unaware of the risks of the terrain. The reason for the trip was never fully documented in a single record. Fragments indicate the purchase of supplies, the exchange of tools, and possibly the negotiation of land in Red Creek. Nothing urgent. Nothing that would justify excessive haste. Still, oral accounts mention a recurring conversation in the days leading up to the trip. The idea of crossing the mountains by the least used route. An old hunting trail that shortened the distance but required precision. This shortcut did not appear on official maps. It was passed on by word of mouth, described with vague references, after the broken rock, before the tree that looks burned from the inside, when the wind changes. Each description varied slightly, depending on who was telling it. Some said that the path had shifted over the years. Others claimed that the mountain itself changed its access points according to the seasons. Margaret Harper, in a statement recorded in 1924, recalls that Elias mentioned the route the night before departure. Not as a definitive plan, but as a possibility. He only said that they would arrive earlier if the weather helped. According to her, there was no enthusiasm in his voice, only calculation. Still, Margaret reported a strange detail. Elias had set aside more provisions than necessary for a short trip, including an extra flashlight and a heavy blanket, even though it was spring. Other neighbors also mentioned minor inconsistencies. Thomas Reed was seen consulting an old map, inherited from his father, that no longer corresponded to the known routes. Caleb Monroe had asked more than once if anyone remembered exactly where the stream branched off after the steep climb. Nothing alarming in isolation. But taken together, these fragments suggest a group that was not as confident as it appeared. On the morning of their departure, the weather was overcast. It wasn't raining, but a low fog covered the fields, making it difficult to see more than a few dozen meters ahead. Still, the men left early, taking with them tools, light bags, and enough supplies for 2 days. They were last seen crossing the wooden bridge that marked the eastern boundary of Pine Hollow. There is a recurring detail in the reports. None of them said goodbye as if they were leaving for something uncertain. There were no prolonged hugs, no emergency instructions. The expectation was a quick return. The shortcut was treated as a practical choice, not a risk. However, in the days that followed, something began to bother the community. First, the lack of news. Then, the absolute silence. No sign left on the main road. No message sent by third parties. Just the passing of hours, then days without a trace. What most unsettled the residents was not just the disappearance, but the growing feeling that the group had entered into something they did not fully understand. Not through recklessness, but through over-reliance on incomplete memories, old accounts, and a mountain that rarely explained its detours. When the second day ended without their return, Pine Hollow began to realize that this trip would not follow the pattern of previous ones. And from that moment on, each new dawn carried a question that no one could answer. At what exact point did the path cease to be the path? The reconstruction of the disappearance inevitably begins with gaps. There are no direct witnesses to what happened after they entered the mountains. What exists are fragments, marks found days later, estimated times, indirect reports of sounds and movements that in isolation seem trivial, but which, when put together, form a disturbing sequence. According to calculations based on the time of departure and the estimated distance, the group should have reached the highest part of the trail before noon. This region of the mountains was known for its dense vegetation and a succession of curves that broke visual orientation. The sun was rarely seen directly there. The light was filtered and diffuse, creating the constant impression of dusk, even in the early hours of the day. The county's weather records indicate that the fog intensified rapidly that afternoon. It was not a common fog. Described as low and dense, it advanced in irregular bands, obscuring the ground and silencing distant sounds. Hunters in the region used to interrupt their activities when this phenomenon occurred, as it erased trails and distorted familiar landmarks. The first concrete clue emerged 3 days after the disappearance. A local search party, made up of residents and 2 county officials, found partially preserved footprints near a steep slope. They were not disordered marks. They followed a relatively cohesive line, as if the group were still together at that point. The curious detail is that the footprints indicated an abrupt deceleration, as if the men had stopped suddenly. Nearby, an object was found, a broken leather strap, later identified as part of Samuel Knox's backpack. The leather showed no clear signs of being cut, but appeared to have been torn by irregular traction, as if it had been pulled forcefully against rocks or roots. No other belongings were found in that area. The search team's reports mention an unusual silence. Not the normal silence of the forest, but an almost total absence of animal sounds. No birds, no perceptible insects. Years later, one of the volunteers described the feeling of walking in a space that did not react to human presence. As they advanced, the trails became inconsistent. Markings appeared and disappeared without apparent logic. At some points it seemed that the group had walked in circles, returning to places very close to each other without realizing it. This hypothesis was reinforced by the most disturbing finding of the search. About a kilometer from the last set of footprints, a carefully constructed campfire was found, protected by stones. The ashes indicated that the fire had been lit but kept burning for only a short time. There were no clear signs of prolonged rest in the surrounding area. No supplies had been laid out, no makeshift shelter had been built. Only the fire, as if it had been made more for guidance than out of necessity. Near the fire, one of the officers found something even stranger. A folded piece of paper, slightly damp, stuck under a rock. It was a page torn from an ordinary notebook. On it were only 3 words written in pencil, in irregular handwriting. The path changes. There was no signature. There was no date. The pressure of the pencil indicated hurried writing, but not desperate. The phrase seemed more like a statement than a cry for help. From that point on, all traces cease. No new footprints, no additional objects, no clear indication of direction. As if, after that point, the group had ceased to interact physically with the environment in a traceable manner. The weather worsened in the following days. Heavy rains erased what remained of the marks. The search was temporarily suspended and resumed weeks later, with no new results. No bodies were found. No clothes, no sign of a collective fall or permanent shelter. The last element confirmed in the official records is a statement taken late, almost forgotten among administrative attachments. A Red Creek resident claimed to have heard, on the night of the disappearance, distant voices echoing through the mountains, but was unable to make out any words. He only said that the sounds seemed to move, receding as they were heard. Something he said he had never witnessed before. The authorities recorded the report, but classified it as inconclusive. No night search was conducted in that direction. The case was officially closed months later, without formal conclusion. In the files, the last piece of evidence attached to the case is not a report, nor a map, nor a statement. It is only the transcription of that phrase found by the campfire, underlined twice by different hands, in different years. The path changes. When the search was officially suspended, Pine Hollow entered a state that was difficult to define. There was no immediate mourning because there were no bodies, nor was there relief because there were no answers. What settled in was a silent wait, sustained by small daily rituals that pretended normality, while something remained open. Families continued to leave lamps lit at dusk for weeks, not as a public sign but as an intimate habit, repeated almost mechanically. Margaret Harper kept to her mealtimes for months, preparing full portions as if Elias might return at any moment. In her later testimony, she would say that the hardest thing was not accepting death, but not knowing when to begin to accept it. County authorities filed the case as disappearance in a difficult-to-access area. No charges were brought. No formal criminal hypothesis was made. Still, internal documents show that the case was never considered completely closed. It reappeared in annual review reports, always with the same marginal note: no progress. As the months passed, indirect reports began to surface. Nothing that could be classified as evidence, but enough to keep the unease alive. One hunter claimed to have found one of the group's machetes months later, leaning against a tree, too far from the estimated route. Another said he saw recent marks on a rock, similar to Caleb Monroe's initials, but that they disappeared after a heavy rain. These reports never coincided in time or location. Each clue appeared isolated, fragmented, as if the case refused to organize itself into a logical narrative. For later investigators, this indicated not a cover-up, but progressive disorientation, not only of the men who disappeared, but also of those who tried to retrace their steps. The most significant revelation did not come from a new physical finding, but from a documentary comparison made years later by a local chronicler. While reviewing old maps, hunting records, and personal diaries from the late 19th century, he noticed something that had gone unnoticed. The shortcut mentioned by the group was not always described in the same place. In different documents, the entrance to the trail appeared to be shifted by tens, sometimes hundreds of meters. This was not due to a gross cartographic error, but to small variations that had accumulated over time. The mountain, subject to landslides, vegetation growth, and constant erosion, had gradually altered its own access points. What was once a continuous path had become a succession of incomplete sections connected only by collective memory. According to this reconstruction, the group would have entered the mountains relying on references that no longer corresponded to the actual terrain. Each correction made along the way, each detour to rediscover the path, took them further away from the original route, not abruptly, but imperceptibly, step by step, choice after choice. This hypothesis helps explain the solitary bonfire, lit not to spend the night, but to reorient themselves. It helps explain the phrase written in pencil, which does not express panic, but rather a belated realization. And it helps explain why no further traces were found. The group may have moved on, believing they were correcting their mistake, when in fact they were only deepening their deviation. There are no signs of violence. There are no signs of confrontation. Only the possibility of progressive exhaustion, decisions made in constant fog, and the slow loss of reliable references. In a mountain range where the terrain changes without warning, that may be enough. Decades later, when the last direct relative passed away, the case was formally closed. But the records were never discarded. They remained archived, revisited occasionally, always with the same feeling of incompleteness. Because, even without bodies, even without an official conclusion, one thing became clear to those who studied the case with historical distance. No one there disappeared all at once. They were lost little by little. Almost 50 years later, when the records had already undergone 3 administrative reforms and Pine Hollow had become just a name on old maps, a regional historian returned to this case with no expectation of solving it. His goal was not to find out where the bodies were, but to understand why that specific disappearance had stood the test of time when so many others had been forgotten. As he reread the documents, he noticed something that did not stand out at first glance. None of the records mention collective panic. None mention running, screaming, or rash decisions. What emerges from the papers is a portrait of men who believed they were doing the right thing until the end. Men who, even in the face of doubt, kept moving forward because turning back seemed to admit a mistake that was not yet fully visible. In the later accounts, the historian also noted the absence of a clear moment of rupture. There is no definitive scene where everything goes wrong. The disappearance does not happen at a specific point on the map, but between points, between one curve and another, between an old reference point and a terrain that no longer corresponded to it, between what memory said and what the eyes could confirm. Harlan Ridge, still exists. Today it is crisscrossed by mapped trails, modern equipment, and clear signage. Still, local guides avoid certain stretches on foggy days, not out of superstition, but out of respect for the way the terrain can be deceiving. The mountain does not need to be hostile to be dangerous. It just needs to be indifferent. When interviewing distant descendants of the families involved, the historian heard softened versions of the story. Over time, the disappearance had become almost a moral warning, a reminder against shortcuts, haste, or overconfidence. But he knew this was a simplification. What happened there was not the result of youthful recklessness, but of accumulated confidence. Confidence in past experiences, in inherited accounts, in paths that had always been where they should be. The last record associated with the case is not official. It is in the historian's own personal notebook, written after his last visit to the region. He describes the feeling of walking along an elevated stretch of the mountain range at dusk, when the light begins to spread unevenly and silence imposes itself. At a specific moment he notes that he stopped, not because of fatigue, but because he realized something simple. There was no immediate sign of error, and that was exactly what made the place dangerous. No memorial was erected. No plaque marks the spot where the men entered the mountains. Over the decades, even the names have faded from collective memory. All that remains are documents, underlined phrases, contradictory maps, and a story that offers no comfortable closure. Perhaps that is why this case still echoes, because it does not speak of the absolute unknown nor of invisible forces. It speaks of something closer and more disturbing, the ease with which human beings continue to move forward when the path quietly ceases to be the path. And in the archives, among yellowed pages and interrupted notes, there remains the only certainty that time has not been able to erase. Some disappearances do not happen the moment someone vanishes, but the moment no one else realizes, they no longer know exactly where they are.